Be a tough act to follow because yours was a fabulous presentation and content, and you had slides, but true to my act and topic, words are all I have because I'm here to do a little bit of demystifying poetry for you. Poetry, kavita. Just the word conjures up all kinds of notions. You know, I can say that if I introduce myself as a writer, it's one thing. Acha, you're a writer. But the minute you say, what do you do? And you say, I write poetry. Or worse still, you say, you are a poet. Oh. And suddenly there are all kinds of expectations, notions, even reactions, even rejections. Even people who are fond of reading otherwise, who read books and magazines and articles and newspapers, somehow tend to stay away a little bit, almost like a little bit of a guarded distance from poetry. And when you think about it, you wonder why. Because there's no clear answer. Sometimes they're like, oh Baba, poetry is not for me, it's too heavy, it's obscure, it's vague, it goes over my head. My sense is their paths didn't cross with poetry. Students, such as yourselves, who have some kind of a flair for it, tend to not pursue it because what is the career option? If you're a poet or if you write good poetry, what is the career in that? And unfortunately, parents also tend to second that. I'm not here to advocate poetry for you. I don't think poetry needs my advocacy. But I want to try over the next 10, 15, 16, 17 minutes to demystify poetry a little bit for you. To, like I said, if your paths haven't crossed with poetry, try to see that your path does come closer to poetry, if not cross it. Because to my mind, poetry is not one thing, it's many, many things. What is it? What is poetry? It's an idea. It's a thought. It's a perspective. It's craft. Amongst many other things. These four things: an idea, a thought, a perspective, and a craft. And beside it being many things, poetry also does many things. What does poetry do? Poetry can help you heal. Yes, right. It's almost like therapy. It can help you heal. It can evoke. It can inspire. And it can transport. We'll look at each of these things carefully. In India, poetry is also a glorious tradition. My speakers ahead of me mentioned about oral traditions. Poetry has also been a fantastic oral tradition in our country. And if you look at all our classical texts across languages, then you'll find that there's poetry embedded in each one of them. For example, the Bhagavad Gita is a collection of 700 verses, each verse set to poetic rhyme. So like I said, I'm not here to advocate poetry, but I am going to try and bring you a tad closer to it. One of the very simplest lines that I have read on poetry is, poetry is language at its most nourishing. Now, we said poetry is many things. Let's look at a few attributes and concepts that are attached to poetry. Let's look at, for example, to begin with, its form and structure. Poetry comes in many forms, many kinds of structures. There are long epics, there are ballads, there can be the 14-line sonnet, there can be the Japanese haiku, which is all of 3 lines. In the Indian context, there's so much. There's doha, there's chopai. Doha is 2 lines. Chopai, like the word suggests, is 4, mostly speaking. There's part. There's ghazal, where each couplet is a sher. There's nazm. There's blank verse, free verse, which is formless, structureless. So what I'm trying to say here is that if you think of poetry and you take it as one lump, it's like taking all the masalas in your kitchen and saying, I don't like masalas. You may not like one, but you may have the taste for another. Now, when you start reading or consuming poetry, two things happen. As you read, as you consume, you discover the form that you like the most if you engage with it. And another thing happens. You discover the form and you also discover which poet you like in which form. For example, you may like Shakespeare's sonnets, or you may like the most ridiculous limerick of 5 lines which is clever, hilarious, humorous, fun. There was an old man in a tree who was buzzed by a horrible bee. When asked, did it buzz? He said, of course it does. It was a brute of a bee. Simple limerick, 5 lines, clever craft, engaging, interesting, eggs you on to read further stuff. I said poetry can do many things. It can heal. You'll be surprised, but it can. Let's understand how. Let's look at how it can heal. You are in a predicament, you are in a situation, it's your problem, your anxiety. You know it best, or so you think. Sometimes what happens is when you're reading poetry, you come across these 3, 4, 5 lines, maybe 6 lines, 10 lines, or maybe just 2 lines. And your exact situation, your state of mind, your perplexity is captured perfectly in those 2, 3, 4 lines. And you're amazed. You don't know the poet. The poet may have long passed, he or she may have deceased, gone on from the face of the world, and you are sitting with 3 lines of poetry that perfectly captures your state of mind, captures it so much better than you can articulate it. And you're amazed. What does it do? At that moment, the first thing that happens to you is you feel you are not alone in this situation. This has happened before. This has happened 100 years ago or 50 years ago, or it's happening to somebody else in a completely different part of the world. You form a sense of connectedness and you feel you're not alone. That itself, friends, gives us a tremendous sense of solace. What else does it do? I said it can transport. Before I come to the transport, I'd like you on the healing bit to look up this poem, which is by an American poet. I think her name is Mary Fry. She writes on bereavement, on losing someone. And all of us, sooner or later, have to face that in our lives. And I won't recite the whole poem for you. You can look it up. It says, "Don't stand at my grave and weep. I am not there, I did not die." She's writing on bereavement, and she's saying, "I did not die." And that poem alone has been read and reread, and it's there on YouTube, it's been recited. One poem of hers, which comes from her sense of loss, has connected so many who are in a state of bereavement. That is healing. Actually, I think some part of the healing also happens because in poetry, if you think about it, there are no good guys or bad guys. No word by itself is a villain. And poetry is not standing in judgment of your thoughts. Rather, what is it doing? It's more like a companion. It's listening. It's trying to understand, and sometimes it's offering that understanding to you. I said that poetry can transport. How does poetry transport? Because with the power of words, you create an imagery. And that imagery, when created masterfully, sometimes can transport you not from a physical place, not from pathways Gurgaon to Calcutta, but also completely take you from this state of mind to a completely different one. So you're transported either physically, like you start imagining a different place, or your state of mind is transformed, your mood is transformed. One of my favorite poets who never fails to transport you with his masterful imagery is Sampurna Singh Kalra. Ever heard of him? How about Gulzar? That's his name. His birth name was Sampurna Singh Kalra. He started off in a garage as a mechanic. And you can read, there's tons and tons and tons of poetry that he's written. He describes the gully, the lane of Mirza Ghalib in Delhi. That's in slightly difficult Urdu, so I won't read that out here. But for example, he can pick up the reins and say, Barish hogi. Barish hogi, barish hogi. Gande pani mein mat jana, kharish hogi. Kharish hogi means khujli hogi. You'll itch. गंदे पानी में मत जाना, खारिश होगी, थोड़े फुंसियां फूटेंगे तो खुजलाओगे, रोते रोते टैंटे करके घर आओगे, ऊपर से फिर कड़वे तेल की मालिश होगी, बारिश होगी, बारिश होगी. See what a mood he's created. This is just 4 lines. The poem goes on for 16, 18 lines. And after you read it, you are like, what a wonderful, fun way to describe the rains for a child, because he is being admonished and warned that don't go out in the rains. If you go out and play in the rains, you'll probably catch some infection, and when you come back home, your mom's going to give you a nice rub of warm sarson mustard oil, which you're not going to like. And such a playful way of creating the imagery of barish. You are transported. I said that poetry can inspire. I think that's a no-brainer. I come from Calcutta, from the land of Rabindranath Tagore. And how many of you are familiar with Tagore? I can't see, but I'm assuming lots of hands go up. He writes this fantastic poem many, many decades, 150 years ago, 120 years ago, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high. Read that? That continues to be the guiding light. Every third, second school that I visit, I see that poem in some corner of the school is either taught, framed. It's like a guiding light. And if you see such simple words where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, into that heaven of freedom, my father, let my country awake. Powerful words, inspiring words. Which brings me to another question. Does poetry always have to carry a message? Does it always have to be very thoughtful? It has to make a lot of sense? I don't think so. Because a lot of poetry can just be fun. It can be entertaining. Who said it can't be? Look at poets like Sukumar Ray, Satyajit Ray's father. Look at Ogden Nash. Look at Lear. You know how Ogden Nash describes in 2 lines, you have a petting zoo here, in 2 lines he describes the cow. The cow is of bovine ilk. One side moo, the other milk. Simple, 2 lines. But look at again the mastery of craft, the way he describes an octopus. We all know, whether we've seen it or not, we can imagine what an octopus looks like. And he says, tell me, O octopus, I begs, are those arms or are they legs? I marvel at thee, O octopus, if I were thou, I'd call me us. So, it doesn't always need to be very heavy. It doesn't always need to carry a message. It can be fun, it can be light, it can be entertaining. However, an important aspect of poetry is knowing how to read it. You don't read poetry like you read a piece of article, a notice, a circular, a magazine, a newspaper. You don't read poetry like that. So what's the best way, a great tip that I have come across in knowing how to read poetry well is, read it in your mind aloud. Read it aloud in your mind. Read it aloud as if you were speaking it to a friend. Because here's what happens when you do that. When you do read aloud a poem in your mind, the words start jumping at you better. You hear it better. When you hear a poem better, you connect with it better. The cadence, the nuances, the musicality of the words, the phrases that the poet has used makes, again, that connectedness between the reader and the poet happens. And that is when you begin to enjoy poetry more. If any of you thought poetry is about words and words alone, think again. I'm currently reading a book called An Uncommon Love by it's about Sudha Murthy and Narayan Murthy. And I come across a page where Narayan Murthy, when he's starting Infosys, you know how he describes a well-written computer program? He writes a computer program, it goes off well, and he says it was sheer poetry. When Roger Federer hits a beautiful forehand, do you know what the commentator says? My God, that was sheer poetry. How does a computer program or a tennis forehand become poetry? Because poetry, the scope of poetry lies beyond words. It lies when each of us, with our calling, hit some kind of an epitome of that calling, which we ourselves cannot replicate very easily. It's an inspired moment. Another fact that I want you to appreciate before I start to wrap up is, how do you tell the difference between, let's say, great and not so great poetry? Surely, suppose I say, Hindi chini bhai bhai, aaj hoga poetry demystified. It rhymes. Is it poetry? Certainly not. Just using heavy vocabulary also, I pick up a thesaurus, I ask AI to use heavy words, and I put together 5 lines that rhyme and sound verbose and sound very impressive. It doesn't lead to good poetry. So then, what is good poetry? How do you tell the difference? To my mind, good or great poetry, first of all, has a long shelf life. What do I mean by that? I mean that you may know the lines by heart, but you go back to them again and again. You draw different things from that poem at different aspects of your life. You continue and enjoy the process of uncovering its layer bit by bit. So for example, so many of you would have read possibly in school or otherwise you would have read Jhansi Ki Rani, Khoob Ladi Mardani Bha to Jhansi Wali Rani Thi. There are so many of these self-defense girls groups across the country that are called Mardani or Jhansi Ki Rani group, just inspired by that one poem or one line by Subhadra Kumari Chauhan. Or you read Faster Than Fairies, Faster Than Witches, Bridges and Houses, Edges and Ditches. Perfect, beautiful imagery captured of a train ride by Robert Louis Stevenson. So there are thousands, the list is endless, but the idea is that you continue to go back to that poet or to his work, her work, and to that poem because you enjoy the act of reading it for different things that it offers at different points of time. I think also, good and great poetry, there's one more difference. Good poetry will not suffocate you. It will liberate. And my personal understanding, and I'd request you to read some of my work and bear me out, my personal understanding is good poetry happens when you have the sincerity of thought and it meets the clarity of craft. Let me try and explain. You have to have a sincere thought. A sincere thought is one which has stayed with you, which carries authenticity, your own belief, and unless and until you don't have that sincerity of thought, your poem will not create an impact, the desired impact. But thought alone is not enough. Because unless and until that thought is well packaged and crafted in great clarity of craft, the poem will not be attractive, it will not be palatable, it will not be interesting. So you have to go on chiseling the craft and nurturing the sincerity of the thought. To my mind, that is when great poetry happens. At this stage, if I'm assured of, no matter how bored, sleepy, tired you already are, if I'm assured of some appreciation, then I'll read out a poem that I had written on just the skies. And today, for example, the sky was what it was. And for this, I'll have to refer to these pages. One day I was sitting, and it was a typical monsoon afternoon at my residence. And the skies were similar to what they are today, grey, misty, colourless, depressing, boring. And then by the evening, suddenly, they completely changed colours. A storm was brewing from a colourless, white, patchy sky. It became blue and angry, and the rains came out. Before that, there was a storm. And I said, this sky that is always hanging above us is quite like a chameleon. It keeps changing colours. So I call it skyscapes. Even the quietest of skies that look widowed and chalky white, as though they haven't a tomorrow nor a hope in sight, can turn to gold by the end of the day. Who'd believe in the morning they were all sullen and grey? Even the quietest of skies that look calm and perfectly blue, as though they haven't a worry nor a thing to do, can turn tempestuous by the end of the day. Ominous laden clouds eclipsing every ray. Even the quietest of skies that haven't said a word in weeks can conspire, collude, and come out in streaks. They can find their voice by the end of the day, roaring and thunder with lightning in their fray. Even the quietest of skies that look like they've gone to bed. Their days often long, their loads they must shed. Those skies to awaken, to embrace every dawn. It's really quite simple. The skies just go on. That's my 2-bit. I hope I've demystified poetry a little for you. I hope you make, or at least begin to make friends with it, because my belief and journey has been that if you make friends with poetry, you would have made friends for life. Thank you very much.